Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is Randy Wright, your captain speaking, and as always, I am joined by my first officer, Jeremy Grapington. We would like to take this opportunity to personally welcome you aboard our state-of-the-art radio program and also to remind you that this is the final boarding call. So if you please, claim your seat, fasten your seat belts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while Jeremy and I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, because there really is a lot of news and information to get to before we may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, tonight's topic of discussion actually arises out of a rather heated and contested conversation that I had with a friend who's near and dear to me. The topic of said conversation centered around one of the most revolutionary economic philosophies or schools of thought that arose during the 20th century. I argued during said conversation that the application of this school of economics really didn't work because it doesn't take into account the wants and needs of the individual. My friend argued that I should just simply admit that I am wrong in this occasion. So, taken a bit aback by that and wanting to get at the truth to make sure that I really was seeing things in a proper perspective, I went ahead and did some digging with my first officer here, and we've discovered some incredible people who shed some insight on to this school of philosophy, or this economic school of thought. Now, the school of economic thought of which I speak is Keynesian economics, which derives its name from the UK economist, John Maynard Keynes. And that basic school of thought says that if you oversave, excessive saving, that harms the economy, and that the government can actually fix an economy. But we know that that goes against the natural law tenets of our shared United States Constitution. It certainly goes against everything that our founding fathers stated. But what's amazing is that there's been so much propaganda put forward by even conservative economists with respect to Keynes, saying that, well, even though he belonged to the Fabian Society, he really wasn't a Fabian. Now, just to back up for a moment to explain what the Fabian Society is, that is a British socialist society that took its name from the Roman general of antiquity that finally defeated Carthage's Hannibal. And he did it by a series of delay tactics, and his name was General Fabius. And he did all of these delay tactics to draw Hannibal further and further and further into Roman territory, thereby exhausting his men and materiel to the point where the Romans had a position to strike and annihilate him. And that's exactly what happened. And so the Fabians pushed for this sort of mentality with entrenching socialist dogma in Western society, particularly in England. But there are Fabian societies in Australia, Fabian societies in New Zealand, in Canada, and yes, even in the United States. But it gets little fanfare because of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media and our educational system. Now, folks, we've often wondered what it is, or when it was, that these utopian socialists were able to take full control. Well, it turns out that a couple of authors, one being Zygmunt Dodd, and the other being Archibald Roosevelt, back in the 1950s, yes, Dobbs, were warning us of the very things that we're seeing right here and right now, and that they were putting it in very similar language to what Jeremy and I have been expressing with respect to these radical socialist deviants that have gone out of their way to wreak havoc here in the United States. And it's just amazing. It's been a half century, and in some cases even more, and they point to the basic linchpin of Fabian Socialist thought and philosophy and doctrine taking place in the United States by route of Harvard University. You know, the place where Obama went to law school, where Elena Kagan was educated, where a lot of the utopian socialists of today were educated. Some things just haven't changed. And it's interesting that Dobbs had a warning for us. He said, what we've done here is compiled a list of those people that were acting in a subversive manner towards the United States, and if the graduates of Harvard wish to stop this type of social deviancy from taking root in the United States, they'd have to act immediately. Well, something happened, because we haven't seen it stop. It's back, it's stronger than ever, and they are doubling down on their efforts. You know, the current head of the Fed is a proponent of Keynesian economics, and Keynesian economics is just a front for utopian socialism. So while my friend says that Keynesian economics works, I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt here and say that yes, it works as a socialist front, but it does not work as an economic school of thought or philosophy.
Well, I'm really drawn in, and we became drawn in last night as we were researching Zygmunt Dobbs and Archibald Roosevelt, who happen to be very good friends, close friends. The things that they spoke about, I mean, even back in the 50s, it's just, like you said, it's tantamount to what's happening today, and it seems like in today's society it has been more shrouded than it was back in the 50s. Back in the 50s, you know, we had the Red Scare and, you know, this and that, the Red State. I believe it was, what was the Commonwealth College in Mena, Arkansas, was considered to be a red institution, so to speak.
Yeah, it was a socialist hotbed or communist hotbed.
Correct. And, you know, Dobbs spoke about this. Individuals spoke of that, and the thing is, back then, you know, this is even back in the 20s, 1928 or so, when, you know, it was looked at as a socialist hotbed or a communist hotbed, and J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, declared that it wasn't. And we see different political individuals and characters in this game of wanting to classify things that aren't what they say they're not, but they really truly are. And again, that's what's caused this whole shroud to be pulled over the American public's eyes with the institution of Fabianism, socialism, communism, all in the grand scheme of, you know, ushering in a totalitarian regime.
And, you know, that's ultimately the goal of the Fabian Socialists. In fact, their original symbol was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Folks, that tells you all you need to know about the Fabian Socialists, about the way they think and view the world. And, you know, there was another telling thing that Dobbs said in one of his writings. It's that the average middle American is not going to be able to have the energy or the time to, or even the political capital to spend to monitor this, to read between the lines. And the Fabians even said that they chose the name that they did, that so only very classically educated people with a very firm grasp of history could understand what it was that they were doing and what they meant by it. And it's a very duplicitous type of elitist mentality, the very sort that we see preached and practiced by Obama and his cronies. This regime is just mired in this stuff, and it is showing no signs of slowing down. In fact, if anything, they're doubling down on their efforts to push forth a Fabian model here. But what is amazing to me is just how many conservatives have bought into the deception of Keynesian economics. And one of the things that Zygmunt Dodd and even Archibald Roosevelt said with respect to Keynesian economics is that it uses very obscure language, and that was done on purpose to hide the true nature of what it is. In other words, it's all a bunch of semantics, and if they make it sound very broad yet simple, then it's more easily accepted, and it will even dupe conservatives into thinking that what they're doing is a good idea, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. And that's what we have to be careful of, because we see that this current regime are, they're absolute masters at this game that has been with us going back to the 1880s. And before, let's see, the Fabian Society got started by 1885, and then Bernard Shaw became the leader of it and led it for 40 years. And here's the thing, folks. They say that Keynes was the savior of capitalism. Then why was he buddy-buddy with Shaw? Now, granted, he was never truly an official member of the Fabian Society, but one of the things that Dobbs and Roosevelt pointed out is that he engaged in red activities as early as 1917, 1918. Keynes helped develop the currency for the Bolsheviks, and he told his mother that during World War I, he was ready to see the social order collapse, and that he would gladly march in London as a Bolshevik. Does that sound like somebody who is the quote-unquote savior of capitalism? Or does it sound like there has been a sham played on Western intellectual thinking since his publication of his so-called general theory on basically employment, economics, and whatnot, which is the Keynesian economic base? And what's so shocking about it is that they pushed out all other forms of economic thought and philosophy in particularly Harvard, which then branched out like a virus, infecting all of the other institutions of higher learning, and then it spread from there to the media, and then from the media to the government, and it just kept spreading and spreading. And that's exactly what's happened today.
Well, anyone who reads anything by Keynes is, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And if you can read between the lines and pay attention to what Keynes said, and then compare it to Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, you'll see that what Keynes has done is actually taken the Communist Manifesto, instead of it being applied to individuals, the bourgeoisie and the proletariats, he's taken it and instituted and changed the game field of being a social demographic to an economical demographic, where he's changed the characters of the bourgeoisie and the proletariats into economic standard characters. And that's what he's done. And you can look at it today. And my thing is, and I've said this numerous times over the past 12 years, economics doesn't mean anything in this country. It truly doesn't. Because what it boils down to is our rights are in jeopardy, they're in peril, and everybody wants to look at things and say, oh, we have a great economic system. The Clinton administration regime implemented and applied Keynesian economics. Even under the George Bush administration, when the Congress was controlled by Democrats, Keynesian economics were applied. Keynesian economics are being applied today. What it is, it's all been changed to create this facade and this false understanding of what true Keynesian economics is. And that creates the problem, again, going back to the Communist Manifesto. When you change the demographic, this is what Fabians and socialists, fascists, communists have all developed with this tactic. If you change things just a little bit to fit the narrative and people adopt that narrative, you have succeeded in implementing and perpetuating your propaganda. That's what it is. That's what it boils down to. Now, going back to what I said with the economy doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't. Because
Right.
all of this is just another facade. It's another thing of implementing political correctness, and I'm sure we'll get to this a little bit later on in the show, Randy, about tolerance.
Oh, yes, we will.
We're seeing that that's the buzzword of today. You have to be tolerant of this. That has been a buzzword for over 100 years with these socialist Neanderthal
Lunatics.
despots. Yes, lunatics.
Right.
So
And Jeremy, I actually want to kind of delve into one of the things Dobbs wrote. See, Keynes had started off with a treatise on money, which failed.
Yes.
So here comes Dobbs' words. He proceeded to formulate a new approach for his political beliefs. For 5 years he labored to put together a theory which would serve to indoctrinate the bulk of the world's economists. He calculated, and correctly, that if economists and economic instructors could be sold a politically inspired so-called economic theory, then these ideas would eventually percolate through to government, the schools, and the general information media. You see, folks, right there, you see exactly what we are experiencing in our modern society. People are wondering why this million-student march is happening. It's because these students are useful idiots. They don't realize that by purporting to support this Fabian Socialist type dogma and movement here, that they are actually setting themselves up for their own death. Because one of the things that Bernard Shaw had written was, you will be forced to live well. They will force you to be fed, they will force you to be clothed, and if you rebel, or if you show any unwillingness to acquiesce to the socialist authority, then you will be executed, albeit in a humane way in your sleep, so he said. But that's the thing. The socialist collectivist inquisition would be able to determine life or death, and they would just go into your home and kill you at night. You see, folks, that is the type of dangerous, degenerate, and wicked sort of philosophy that we're facing. It's nothing new that things like with Obamacare and the death panels would be a part of a Fabian socialist agenda. The idea is they want to look for a superior type of person that applies to society, that can always give to society. And once a person's usefulness to society is gone, they are done away with. Euthanasia is absolutely a part of the Fabian movement, and Keynes was a dyed-in-the-wool Fabian. In fact, to use his own words, to understand my state of mind, however, Keynes said, you have to know what I believe myself to be, writing a book on economic theory which will largely revolutionize, not, I suppose, at once, but in the course of the next 10 years, the way the world thinks about economic problems. When my new theory has been duly assimilated and mixed with politics and feelings and passions. You see, right there, folks, it's not the economy he's aiming for. It's all of those other things. I can't predict what the final upshot will be in its effect on action and affairs, but there will be a great change, and in particular, the Ricardian foundations of Marxism will be knocked away. In other words, to make Marxism more acceptable to society. He said this in a letter to Fabian leader Bernard Shaw. Would a capitalist, the so-called savior of the free market capitalist society, really do that sort of writing and send it to the leader of the Fabian group? And here's the thing. He was proposing a mixed economy. In other words, part government control or command economy, as you see in communism, part free market. Well, Marx said that that is the first step towards communism.
Now, let's break this down a little bit. You said certain things are going to be used in order to get this economy entrenched. Certain feelings, actions, things that
Passions.
people will latch onto. Mm-hmm. Well, let's name a few of those things. First, it was global warming. Now it's climate change because it makes people feel so much better. playing on the emotions of individuals.
The war on poverty.
The war on poverty, the war on women. If folks remember Al Gore and his carbon credits. Remember the carbon credits? That was all designed to do what? Fatten his pockets, to create an economy, even though it was a more localized one just for him. But I'm willing to bet that he actually opened up his coffers to institute things on a grander scale, like this climate change that's going on. All this, climate change, and damn the cartographers, and that we must end the penguins exploding. All of these things, everything that you see, whether it's with preaching about tolerance, gay marriage, homosexual marriage, homosexual rights, transgender stuff. You see these new city ordinances in New York City. If you mislabel somebody by not speaking to them about their certain gender, you get their gender wrong, you can be fined because it's intolerant. All of these things are categorically latched onto each other. They're all smaller pieces of the puzzle that Dobbs was warning us about.
Mm-hmm. And, Keynes's own words. Let's go back to December 1917 and a letter that Keynes wrote to his mother. He's talking about the World War I, and he says that what frightened him is the prospect of general impoverishment, even though that he says he wants to see the disappearance of the social order. So I'll just read this whole thing because it's staggering. He said, "My Christmas thoughts are that a further prolongation of the war, with the turn things have taken, probably means the disappearance of the social order we have known hitherto. With some regrets, I think I am, on the whole, not sorry." So he's already saying that he wants to see the collapse of the social order as we know it, and that's always what socialists do. He then goes on, "The abolition of the rich will be rather a comfort, and serve them right anyhow." Again, would a capitalist say this? No. "What frightens me more is the prospect of general impoverishment. In another year's time, we shall have forfeited the claim we had staked out in the New World, and in exchange this country will be mortgaged to America." So you see, he was already upset with a capitalist country being able to basically get up on England because of the war and because of war debt and war lending. But he then goes on, "Well, the only course open to me is to be buoyantly Bolshevik. And as I lie in bed in this morning, I reflect with a good deal of satisfaction that because our rulers are as incompetent as they are mad and wicked, one particular era of a particular kind of a civilization is very nearly over." That is staggering. That is Bolshevik language. He even proclaims to be buoyantly Bolshevik, excitedly Bolshevik. Mm-hmm. Is that really the type of person that would save a capitalist economy? Folks, these are his own words. We're not making this up.
Yeah, and the fact that Keynes actually touted the idea, in order for governments to, end debt, you have to spend money to end debt. Well, that would be akin to somebody, having a bank account, mm-hmm. and their debt is more than what they have in their bank account, but they would empty their bank account to play the lottery.
Right.
In hopes of winning enough money. They would spend all their money in hopes of winning or amassing an amount of money in order to pay off their debt. Well, that's not economic sense, folks. That's called gambling.
And on a national scale, it's called socialism.
And this is exactly what Keynes was all about. He professed to the world that I'm not a Marxist, I don't follow this, but yeah, he turned right around and claimed to be a Bolshevik and latched onto himself with being Bolshevik. He entangled himself in many different ways, mm-hmm. Which we'll probably get to later on,
with
other Fabians Well, let's just cover it now. The guy was a sexual deviant. He
Oh,
was
he absolutely
homosexual.
was.
He was a homosexual, and he was actually a pedophile.
Yep.
I
Yep.
and I have right now one of Dobbs's writing entitled "Sugar Canes." Lovely play on words. I mean, Dobbs is a phonetic genius.
He really is.
He is a phonetic genius. I mean, this guy he entitles this article called "Sugar Canes," and in the article he states, "Singing the red flags," the first paragraph. "The high-born sons of the British upper class lay on the carpeted floor, spinning out socialist schemes in homosexual intermission. Sometimes one of the participants would shout out an obscenity. Then, as if on signal, the entire group would join in a frenzied babble of profanity. Here and there, individuals would smoke or chew hashish. Most had unkempt hair, and some sported beards. The attitude in such gatherings was anti-establishmentarian. To them, the older generation was horribly out of date, even superfluous. The capitalist system was declared obsolete, and revolution was proclaimed as the only solution. Christianity was pronounced as an enemy force, and the worst sort of depravities were eulogized as, quote, that love which passes all Christian understanding," unquote.
Meaning love of the government.
Correct. Now, when he spoke of the older generation was horribly out of date, these were the true classical liberals and conservatives that this country was founded upon by.
Mm-hmm.
Those that followed and adhered to the Constitution, because the Constitution is 180 degrees polar opposite and diametrically opposed to anything socialist, communist, Fabian,
or Keynesians.
So
would support. Yes, absolutely.
Right. So
and here's the other thing. Let's go back to Keynes's own words again. This comes from Dobbs, and it says, "The following year, Keynes reiterated to his mother about, quote, being a Bolshevik," close quote. Mm-hmm. In September 1918, Keynes wrote confidently, "My most amusing job just lately has been to invent a new currency for Russia. Dudley Ward and I have been spending a great deal of time on the details, as we have had to design the notes, get them printed, choose the personnel, answer conundrums, and do the whole thing from top to toe. We hope to have a plan launched on the world in 2 or 3 weeks' times." And what that absolutely was, is this idea of The Life of Keynes by Herod, and it's talking about how he actually went to Russia to help create the Bolsheviks' currency and to help push forward this Bolshevik idea. He was a die-in-the-wool socialist, and that's why he remained lifetime friends with the Fabians, and he was very, very close. And in fact, the people that helped him write his book, the General Treatise on employment and on economics, basically, is just, it takes it straight from communism. You know, a mixed economy comes straight out of the Communist Manifesto of 1847.
Yes. Now, in this article, this piece that Dobbs wrote, Sugar Canes, he goes on to say, Keynes was characterized by his male sweetheart, Leighton Strachey, as, quote, a liberal and sodomite, an atheist and a statistician, end quote. His particular depravity was the sexual abuse of little boys. In communications to his homosexual friends, Keynes advised that they go to Tunis, quote, where bed and boy were also not expensive, unquote. As a sodomistic pedophiliac...
So he was a cheap sodomite.
Sure. As a sodomistic pedophiliac, he ranged throughout the Mediterranean area in search of boys for himself and his fellow socialists. taking full advantage of the bitter poverty and abysmal ignorance in North Africa, the Middle East, and Italy, he purchased the bodies of children prostituted for English shillings. See, folks, we have that here in the United States. That mentality. There's the organization known as NAMBLA.
Yep.
I'm sure that rings a bell with many individuals. Mm-hmm. But see, the whole auspice of Keynes was to utilize these tactics and these measures in order to institute a grand scheme of ushering in totalitarian rule. The article further goes on to say, such leftist hypocrites then, as now, issued loud denunciations against poverty, imperialism, and capitalist immorality. So they would, while doing these very things, they're decrying, oh, capitalism is bad. We have to end poverty. Imperialism, get rid of the 3%ers, tax the rich, so on and so forth. They are setting people up and using their feelings and emotions in a guise to get them to become more tolerant to their own social deviant actions in order to get people engaged in doing the same. That way they have full control, because when people do what they do and follow along with that crowd, it creates the sense that there is a unity amongst all of them, a commune, if you will. This is what communism is. They want everybody to do things equally, all the way across the board, all their efforts. That way, all of that can be used for the perception of the common good, but more than likely what it turns out to be is those elitists like Keynes and his
other sodomite friends.
His other sodomite friends, such as Strachey, to do as they please with it and to go on and live their utopian socialist dream.
Right. And see, here is something else Dobbs said. He said Keynes's opus was finally published under the title of The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. This work has since been embraced by socialists all over the world as their basic theoretical guide. And now, Jeremy, this part you're going to like because it reiterates kind of what we have said with respect to the economy. We do not intend to deal in detail with the technical, mathematical, and statistical aspects of this work. This has been done very competently by others, and especially by Henry Hazlitt in his Failure of the New Economics, an analysis of Keynesian fallacies. We are more interested in the social and political motives that impelled Keynes to put this work together. Hazlitt hit upon the heart of the matter when he wrote, "In the general theory, in brief, Keynes did not suddenly discover that the traditional economic virtues were really vices and vice versa. He had particularly always thought so. All that he hit upon was a new rationalization for his old bias." And what's interesting is that there was a socialist economist at Harvard, Professor Joseph A. Schumpeter, who said basically the same thing. He said, the process stands out in this case with such unsurpassable clearness because we can read a formulation of the vision as yet analytically unarmed. In a few brilliant passages of Keynes' The Economic Consequences of Peace from 1919. He then went on to say, it is true that in economics and still more in other social sciences, this sphere of the strictly provable is limited in that there are always fringe ends of things that are matters of personal experience and impression from which it is practically impossible to derive ideology, or for that matter, conscious dishonesty. Completely. Conscious dishonesty. You see, folks, that's what you have to look for. You have to root out just the little hidden code words of what they're trying to say. So basically what Schumpeter was saying here is that no, this wasn't broken away from his personal feelings. This wasn't an objective scientific study. And, we see that again with global flattening and warming and all of that other nonsense that is being passed off as science today. But it's not science. It follows this Fabian idea where they want to politicize logic altogether. But folks, truth and logic cannot be politicized. It just cannot be politicized. But that's the devious nature of the socialist in our midst. They believe that they can socialize and can politicize the numbers. And if they can't get the numbers to fit their ideology, then they will make it up. And that is exactly what we see with Keynes. Remember, Keynes said that excessive saving is detrimental to the economy at large. His general theory, even in the play on words here, is meant to apply at all times. Now, a lot of modern economists try to say that he meant for that only to apply in a recession, but no, that's not what he meant, and that's never the way that it was taught in the economic schools. Why else would fascists like Mussolini, Nazis like Hitler, and communists like Joseph Stalin all support the work of John Maynard Keynes if it was not a political type of diatribe, which is exactly what it is. And we are seeing the ill effects of it today. Folks, all of the cooking of the books that you see in the economy, where they keep working down the unemployment or working it back up or not counting everybody because they want to keep the numbers low, that is all a practice in Fabianism, because it's all about image, not truth.
Sure. And Schumpeter, who also was a socialist and a theoretician at Harvard, did some writings there. And one of his writings of fascist economists under Mussolini, this is what Schumpeter said. It is important to emphasize that even in treatises that took a professedly sympathetic attitude to the città corporativa, or corporative state, the analytic parts did not differ from generally accepted economic doctrine and could have been written just as well by enemies of fascism. Now, what Schumpeter is saying there is basically that, anybody can come up with a economic theory. Anybody could have come up with the economic theory that Keynes did on either side. But the fact still remains that the analytic parts did not differ from generally accepted economic doctrine. Well, when the Fabians and the socialists are creating the economic doctrine for individuals to adhere to and latch on, remember what Dobbs wrote. Mm-hmm. People will not have the time or the energy or the money to put into things that they have to understand regarding the politics of the country. If they don't have the time, effort, or money to put into the understanding of it, they're going to latch on to things that they're told to latch on to. This is the key part of this.
And, it's interesting how I was just saying that the Fabians engage in this dishonesty. Folks, you don't just have to take my word for it. I'm going to give you the words of Mrs. Cole, who was high up, one of the original Fabians. She mentions Keynes and herself specifically with how deception is used by left-wing theoreticians. And here are her words. This technique of using unquestioned but carefully selected facts, in other words, like what we see with global warming where they fudge the temperature data, to establish a decline in working class standards, again, to say that we need more government, has been employed by other writers, of whom one at any rate has gone so far as to show that the British working class has been getting steadily worse off ever since the Industrial Revolution. In other words, they're lying about what was happening with the British middle class. Then she goes on to state, on which one can only comment, if you can believe that you can believe that, you can believe anything. "I am not proud of this performance of mine," she said. "I only plead that greater minds than my own have been guilty of special pleading," meaning special selecting of facts, "under the influence of strong emotional ideas. Keynes, for example." There you have it, folks. That was one of his friends. That was a Fabian socialist. Is this about a scientific doctrine? Is this about being realistic? Is this about saving capitalism? No. It is about using capitalism to destroy capitalism. It's about using traditional institutions to destroy traditional institutions. And where have we heard that with the Constitution? Oh, yes, that's right, the ACLU. That they were going to use the Constitution to destroy the Constitution. But just like Lincoln, who had a bunch of Marxists in his own midst, he said that he's going to abuse the Constitution to save the Constitution, just as Keynes was going to abuse capitalism to supposedly save capitalism. It's a lie. It's a lie. That's all it is.
That's akin to saying, if you have a child that is, destructive in nature, is a hazard to itself, and whether there's mental issues going on or not, none of that matters. But just a child, always wanting to do destructive things, always, being aggressive, authoritative, rebellious against the parent, so on and so forth, for the parent to, instead of disciplining them, beating that child because it will save the child. That's called resentment, folks. Yes. There's a time for discipline, and it has to be administered properly. But when you take on something that you want to say is a discipline, or which is nothing more than an abuse, in order to save that which you're abusing, it's counterproductive. It cannot work. There's no possible way that it could that it can work. If I could simplify it even more, it's kind of like, your house catches on fire.
Right.
Well, if your house is on fire, instead of putting the fire out, you light other fires in hopes to suck the oxygen away from the main fire, because the fire cannot burn without oxygen. So if you deprive the oxygen by doing more destructive things, like, your kitchen's on fire, so let's go start a fire in the bedroom and hope it draws all the fire away.
Or use gasoline to try and put it out.
Or use gasoline to try and put out. Either way, you cannot be destructive towards something that you're trying to save, because you will destroy it.
Right.
It's counterintuitive and counterproductive. Abusing the Constitution in order to, save the Constitution or to protect it doesn't wash. You cannot abuse the Constitution to begin with. It's prohibited from being abused.
It is prohibited, and it's violative of the fact that the Constitution itself is a practice of natural law, which, unlike any of this Fabian Socialist garbage, is timeless, which means that it's just applicable today as it was over 200 years ago when this country was first conceived. But, another startling aspect of this is just how the Fabian Socialists attempt to use useful idiots to carry out their design. Going on with your fire metaphor here, Jeremy, the Fabian Socialists would use groups like Black Lives Matters or the NAACP or these other, all of these various organizations with all of these morons that all of these morons that just go march out in circles to say that we're here, and that includes the homosexual movement. They view them as tools to be used. But folks, you don't have to take my word for it. Here is what Bernard Shaw said. Such freaks should be pitied and painlessly killed without malice as a mad dog is killed, and so should all who are not worth their salt and are spoiling the lives of those who are worth their salt. Under socialism, he continued, the procedure, as far as we can foresee it, will be for the police to establish a capital case and bring the accused to trial by jury as usual. But the judge, instead of passing sentence, will report the case and the verdict to the Inquisition to consider whether the accused can safely be allowed to live at large in a civilized community. This will keep both the accused and the non-accused in check, as the execution would be carried out at the cover of night in the dwelling place of the accused.
And they're both kept in check with each other by way of instituting tolerance.
Of course.
That's where the tolerance comes in. See, the Fabians utilized tolerance. Keynes utilized tolerance. The communists, they all utilized the term tolerance, again, to attach an affection to their agenda.
They do it to dupe people, and that's literally what Dobbs called the people that have been used by the Fabian Socialists. They're dupes. They're morons. They're useful idiots.
Yes, and I believe it was Lenin who coined the phrase "useful idiots," if I'm not mistaken. Lenin or Stalin?
It was Lenin.
It was Lenin. Yeah. Well, communist is a communist, red through and through. So, it's when people don't understand this, and again, this is why we're bringing this to everybody. And, like Randy said, don't take our word for this. We're reciting verbatim the exact words from these individuals that have been perpetuating this nonsensical drivel. It's going back to all these actions to make people, with the feelings and emotions, you have climate change. It's nothing but panem et circenses is what it is. Our society has become so entrenched in being tolerant or distracted because, again, Dobbs mentioned and foresaw this happening, that people would not have the time, nor the energy, nor the inclination, because of the lack of the others, to actually take notice of what's going on. This has been their scheme the whole time, ever since 1884 when the Fabian Society was created. It was even before then, I believe the 1830s, 1838, I think, when the Communist Manifesto was written.
1847 originally. And remember, 1848 was when they had all of their socialist revolutions. That was the year of revolution in Europe.
Correct. So, we're, 160 some years, 170 years into this, to where this has been implemented and progressively implemented and perpetrated in this country. The Fabians, came over to the United States in the 1840s, or the communists did. Fabians, 1884, they came over, they latched onto the communists and started perpetuating things. We had individuals like Theodore Roosevelt, who wasn't always progressive in his line of thinking, but they got to him.
Yeah.
And thankfully, his youngest son, Archibald, never adopted any of this. Even when he was younger, he adhered to it because everybody, when they're young at a certain age, understands that everybody has liberal or leftist, ideologies.
Sure. And with the case of Dobbs, he was raised in a communist family.
Sure. So there's always that influence there. It's only when people realize what's going on and they take notice. See, folks, this is why we're doing this. It doesn't matter what age group you're in. If you're 18 to 25 years old, or you're 65 to 80 years old, and you're listening to this show,
Right.
In any
And now,
episode, it's being put out there for you. Whether your ideology is bent completely opposite of what ours is, these are the facts. This is the truth. We don't have an agenda because we speak the truth. The truth has no agenda.
right, right. And, just to give you kind of an idea of how even conservatives or so-called conservatives can be duped by the left wing's web of deceit, Bruce Bartlett wrote a piece in Forbes. Now, Bartlett was an economist under the Reagan administration and then again under George H.W. Bush, and he wrote a piece called that Keynes was actually a conservative, a free market one. And here's what he said. He said that Keynes's efforts advocating government deficits to maintain jobs and growth in recession were motivated by a strong desire to maintain the liberal capitalist order, lest people jettison it for socialism. Except when we go back to Keynes's own words in December of 1917, when he was not young, remember, he was an economist at that time, and he was born in the 1880s, so he was not young. He said, "The only course open to me is to be buoyantly Bolshevik, and as I lie in bed in the morning, I reflect with a good deal of satisfaction that, because our rulers are as incompetent as they are mad and wicked, one particular era of a particular kind of a civilization is very nearly over." That is his true leanings, and he never backed away from it. He doubled down on it. That's why he stayed close to Lippmann and Frankfurter and Bernard Shaw. These were not capitalists, folks. These were the people that were going out on the tirade saying that the industrialists were raping the average working class citizen and that socialism had to come in, even if it was in small steps or incrementalization, to save the working class from the bourgeoisie that was just running ramshod over them, and that we had to destroy the social order. That is not what you get with a savior. This messianic type of view is very reminiscent of what Hitler and Mussolini did. And is it any surprise when you see that fascism is just a facade of socialism with this capitalist veneer? It gives a false perception. But folks, you don't have to take my words for it. Let me say what Mussolini personally said with respect to Keynes. He said, "Fascism entirely agrees with Mr. Maynard Keynes, despite the latter's prominent position as a liberal. In fact, Mr. Keynes' excellent little book, The End of Laissez-Faire, 1926, so the end of true free market. That's the invisible hand. Don't mess with it. The market will correct itself." He wrote the book, The End of Laissez-Faire in 1926, might, so far as it goes, serve as a useful introduction to fascist economics. There is scarcely anything to object to in it, and there is much to applaud. That's Mussolini, folks. The guy who started off as an editor-in-chief in a socialist newspaper, who's named after Mexico's early socialist president, Benito Juarez. But, again, we have modern conservatives saying that Keynes was really a conservative. If Keynes was a conservative, does that mean that Mussolini was a conservative and that the National Socialist German Workers' Party is a conservative? Well, the way that the historical revisionists of today would have you believe, yes, but that is not the truth.
Well, here's another thing that Dobbs wrote in his Keynes at Harvard addendum. Sugar Keynes. He says Keynes and his conspirators projected homosexuality and drug addiction as an intrinsic part of their collectivist society of the future. His male sweetheart, again, Leighton Strachey, wrote privately that they would corrupt the whole population, quote, subtly through literature into the bloodstream of the people, and in such a way that they accepted it all naturally, if need be, without at first realizing what it was to which they were agreeing, end quote.
And you know what that sets up with? You know those commercials that say love has no labels? They've got the
Yes.
skeletons behind the screen and then it's lesbians.
But yeah, exactly. But he goes on to say
Mm-hmm.
he boasted that he intended, quote, to seduce his readers to tolerance through laughter and sheer entertainment, unquote. He pointed out that the object was, quote, to write in a way that would contribute to an eventual change in our ethical and sexual mores, a change that couldn't be done in a minute, but would unobtrusively permeate the more flexible minds of young people, unquote. Then Keynes put it in the terms of Marxist economics, like I
Right.
spoke of before. When the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. We shall be able to rid ourselves of many pseudo moral principles which have ridden us for 200 years. Now, see, this people would read this and say, "Oh, well, he's just attacking homosexuality and drug addiction, and drug users and so on and so on." No,
Right.
it is specific. They have this designed. This was all premeditated and designed. They're doing it now through tolerance. They're preaching tolerance, whether it's homosexual marriage, whether it's forcing people to accept an individual like bruised gender. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm a woman, even at 60 years old. I'm a man, but I feel like a woman. Who started all that, nonsense? I feel like a woman. Shania Twain, a useless Canadian. I mean, come on, folks. I mean, all of this stuff is, again, it's all right here. This article was actually written in 1971 from the Review of the News, June 23rd, 1971, condensed from American Opinion. This was an addendum written by Zygmunt Dobbs to Keynes at Harvard, Economic
Right.
Deception as a Political Credo.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
you know, one of the things that Dobbs was pointing to in all of this is that Keynesian economics is a collectivist formula. The idea that government can come in and spend, that it's all based on collectivization, and that's at the very heart of it. In fact, he says the same collectivist formula fits both fascism and socialism. In his brilliant work, The Road Ahead, John T. Flynn states the line between fascism and Fabian socialism is very thin. Fabian socialism is the dream. Fascism is Fabian socialism plus the inevitable dictator. And then Dobbs adds, to the unsophisticated socialist follower, the statement by a fascist that Keynesianism is pure fascist premises must come as a shock. However, history proves this to be true. Keynes's socialist ideas have been studied and adopted in turn by Soviet Russia, Fascist Italy, Perón's Argentina, Nehru's India, Tito's Yugoslavia, and the State of Israel. Remember the kibbutz system? That was based on a Keynesian model, believe it or not.
yes. And even fascist economic journals, it goes on to say, uh, are replete with Fabian social sources of reference, including such names as G.D.H. Cole, Madam Cole you spoke of, Graham
Uh-huh.
Wallace, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and Bernard Shaw. And again, we've referenced these individuals prior to this. It just goes on and on and on. Again, folks, this is this is what Randy and I have been saying ever since our beginning of the Wright Flyer. We've been speaking at volumes of this, even though it was, you know, minor points here and there. It's all tied in together. Okay, when we when Randy approached me to help him with this, to work on this, we had an understanding with each other that we have the idea and the premise to restore what our country was founded on.
Exactly. And it's going to take a lot of work. But part of it is we just have to understand the depth of destruction and desecration that has occurred in our country. And folks, it has been deep. Because the utopian socialists have been planning this for well over a century. They have been enacting it for well over half a century, and they are doubling down because they see the light at the end of the tunnel. They believe that they are coming on the point where they will finally have their twisted machinations become reality, and that will become a permanent fixture of the United States and the political landscape of the United States, irrespective of the detrimental harm that it's going to have on the country at large. They don't care. They don't care about you. Just as what Shaw said, these freaks should be killed. Folks, we don't want to kill anybody. We want to restore our country to individual liberty. The people that are sitting there marching, saying all of this ridiculous nonsense and all of this hyperbole as if it is the truth, they have been duped. They are useful idiots who are going to go about their own destruction because they are mentally weak.
And, it's not just citizens in this country that have been duped. It's been politicians as well. January 4th,
very well-educated people, very well-respected people.
January 4th, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced, "I am now a Keynesian in economics." See, this is why we don't have allegiance to either party, or to any party for that matter.
Right, and then
we're American citizens. Our adherence and allegiance is to the United States Constitution and the restoration of our republic.
Right. And to the economist that worked for Reagan, I believe his name was Bruce Bartlett,
yes,
to say that Keynes was a conservative, well, let me quote Keynes' own words that he wrote in The Nation, a British newspaper, in the 30s. He said, "When the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. Mm-hmm. We shall be able to rid ourselves of many pseudo-moral principles which have hag-ridden us for 200 years, by which we have exalted some of the most distasteful of human qualities into the position of the highest virtues." Folks, that is a condemnation of capitalism. But he goes on from another book, or from another writing in 1932, he reiterated atheistically that the decaying religions around us, which have less and less interest for most people unless it be as an agreeable form of magical ceremonial or of social observance, have lost their moral significance just because, unlike some of their earlier versions, they do not touch in the least degree on these essential matters. A revolution in our ways of thinking and feeling about money may become the growing purpose of contemporary embodiments of the ideal. Perhaps, therefore, Russian communism does represent the first confused strings of a great religion, or first confused stirrings of a great religion. He's calling communism a religion!
Yeah, and see, remember, if you remember, Keynes' own quote-unquote soulmate what was described as, saying that Christianity was an enemy. Keynes was a devout atheist. Communists were atheists. Socialists are atheists. The Fabians, all devout atheists. But yet, if they're atheists, they want to institute something as a religion. Now, people say, well, atheism is a religion. Well, you have to take that as a grain of salt, because atheism is not believing in anything of a higher power, so on and so forth, but religion is actually acknowledging and admonishing a higher power to a certain degree. It's kind of diametrically opposed to that.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
and
Lenin,
that there's something to say about what Keynes did. folks, we talk about Planned Parenthood and the type of depravity that we see there. Keynes also put out in 1932 this. He said that marriage laws, the treatment of sexual offenses and abnormalities, the economic position of women, the economic position of the family, in all these matters, the existing state of the law and of orthodoxy is still medieval, altogether out of touch with civilized opinion and civilized practice, and with what individuals, educated and uneducated alike, say to one another in private. Wow. So people that are sitting there with their jaw on the floor looking at what Obama's done with things like the Obergefell decision, all of these pushes to overturn our institutionals, our traditional institutions, it's all interrelated. And Keynesian economics is the front at which they use to infect our university system, then our media, and then our government. We are seeing this destructive line of thought, and it's all designed to keep the people into believing that things are just abysmal and that we have to hold a stopgap measure until the great socialist revolution can come. That's not saving capitalism. That is preparing capitalism for suicide.
Sure. And, Nikolai Lenin hailed Keynes, and he put him up on a pedestal. In 1919, and again, I'm reading from the article Sugar Keynes, Keynes authored The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was promptly acclaimed from Moscow by Nikolai Lenin himself. The Red Dictator declared, quote, "Nowhere has the Versailles Treaty been described so well as in the book by Keynes." A special edition of The Economic Consequences was printed under the label of the Fabian Society, and Frankfurter and Lippmann, both Fabians, brought the manuscript to the United States and arranged with Harcourt and Brace to publish it here. The volume became required reading among American socialists and communists.
Mm-hmm. And see, the thing that Schumpeter, a neo-Marxist, had said was that, and he was a Harvard economics professor for 20 years, the one thing he did complain about with Keynes's general theory is that it had supplanted Marx and was the outstanding success of the 1930s, and that it dominated analytic work for a decade after its publication, to say at the least. He was begrudgingly saying that, okay, it's not as far as I want it to be, but he was able to push the socialist agenda, making it easier to move towards communism.
Yeah, and this article goes on to say, it says, however, Keynes's value as a hidden red was in danger, meaning communist. The Fabians had developed the posture of respectability to a fine art, and the value of Keynes's book as an impartial work was in jeopardy. With Keynes's future usefulness in upper-class circles at stake, Lenin had personally come to the rescue. He pulled the classic leftist double twist, praising Keynes's book as a model for communist revolutionaries, and at the same time covering for Keynes by labeling him as anti-Bolshevik. See, again, with the labeling, this whole labeling thing is a Fabian tactic right from the word go.
Right.
Nikolai Lenin rose before the Second Congress of the Communist International and declared, quote, I will quote another economic source which assumes particularly great significance. The British diplomat Keynes, the author of The Economic Consequences of Peace, who on the instructions of his government took part in the Versailles peace negotiations, watched them directly from purely bourgeois point of view, studied the subject step by step, and took part in the conference as an economist. He arrived at conclusions which are stronger, more striking, and more instructive than any a communist revolutionary could advance, because they are conclusions drawn by an acknowledged bourgeois.
Yes. And see, when we warn about economics, we warn of it because it's a type of trap. It is used to push an agenda, and you may not even be aware of it just because of how subtle it is. And this comes from John Strachey, or Strachey, who was a very high up Fabian. He said, "The fact that the study begins at the economic end of the social complex may be thought to imply a particular view of the nature, workings, and interconnections of human society. And so it does. It implies, that is to say, a conviction that the economic, political, and all other aspects of society are interconnected, that they interact in a way which it is just beginning to be possible to understand. But it does not imply that the economic aspect of society is the unique determinant of all the rest." On this famous issue, it implies no more and no less than this: that the way in which men get their livings, the techniques, in the broadest sense of that term, by which at any given time and place they produce the wherewithal of life, profoundly affects and is profoundly affected by the economic, social, and political relationships in which they find themselves involved. For whether they know it or not, they have entered into those relationships, which in the last resort are relationships of power of one over all, largely at least in order to operate the techniques available to them. So, in other words, he's saying attack from the field of economics to then pollute everything else. Hide yourself in economics because most people are so ingrained in their day-to-day facets of life that they don't have the time or political expedient capital to spend on it. So, in other words, they want to dupe us all and force us all into this type of trap. This is so intellectually disingenuous, it is beyond belief. It seems like something you would expect to read in a comic book. But folks, this is real. It's been with us since the turn of the last century.
You know, I just came across something very interesting. It mentions other individuals in this article that had dealings with Keynes and Leighton Strachey. You know, the Fabian homosexual circle was incredibly successful in gaining influence and control in a wide area of activity. They staked out the entire British Empire and the United States as well. Leighton Strachey wrote to Keynes, and again I'm quoting from Sugar Keynes, "Oh dear me, when will my heaven be realized, my castle in Spain? Rooms, you know, for you, Duncan and Swithin as fixtures, Wolfe, of course, too, if we can lure him from Ceylon, and several suites for guests. Can you conceive anything more supreme? I should write tragedies, you would revolutionize political economy, Swithin would compose French poetry, Duncan would paint our portraits in every conceivable combination and permutation, and Wolfe would criticize us and our works without remorse. This projection," Dodds goes on to say, "was incredibly prophetic. John Maynard Keynes became the mastermind behind the economic structure of British and American socialism. Strachey was responsible for writing books that undermined the Christian ethic of the 19th century and set the tone for the pornographic and depraved literature of today. Leonard Wolfe worked out the details of the socialist drive for world government. He was not only the architect of the League of Nations, but outlined the structure of the United Nations." So here we have it, folks. The UN was designed with the collaboration and put in place by Fabians.
Absolutely. And
Fabians.
And if you recall, Woodrow Wilson was of this academician type circle of academia, of the ivory tower. He was part of it, and he was a wholehearted adherent of the Fabian socialist ideals. That's why he pushed wartime socialism when the United States finally entered World War I, and he did it to exponentially increased the power, scope, and influence of the federal government in a way which was previously unimaginable. And folks, what this all comes down to is that they were in a concerted effort to make everything political. If you look at the way that the utopian socialists work today, they want to politicize everything. I'm sure you all recall that right after the Umpqua Community College shooting there in Roseburg, Oregon, President Obama basically came out and said, we've just got to politicize this. Well, let's look back to Keynes's father, John Neville Keynes, who was a don at the University of Cambridge. He wrote a book entitled The Scope and Method of Political Economy. In this work, Keynes attacked the principle of laissez-faire, free economy, and dealt with socialist doctrines in a friendly light, including the way that seemingly unpolitical things, non-political matters, should be politicized in order to push forward the agenda of socialism. Folks, they haven't changed. You know how they keep saying it's new? Go back to FDR. He called it a New Deal. There was nothing new about that. That was Fabian Socialism. Obama's supposed new executive orders to infringe upon the fundamental and unalienable right of the American people to keep and bear firearms, that's not new. That's right out of the Communist Manifesto, out of Keynesian principles, and we see that Keynes got this from his own father.
You know, I'm thinking this is why Dobbs and Archibald, or Archikins, who I've actually think that I'm going to refer to as Archikin Skywalker from here on out, were best of friends. Archibald, or Archikin Skywalker, Roosevelt, again, in his very young age, had leftist-leaning ideologies, but then grew up, understood, came to the realization that this is wrong. Right about the same time that happened, his father began the progressive movement because he was infiltrated by the Fabians. See, right. Archie was diametrically opposed to his father. Archie is, if there's anybody in history in the 20th century that could exemplify what a true American hero is, it's Archie Roosevelt. He was the recipient of, 2 silver stars with oak leaf clusters?
He had 1 silver star, 1 bronze star. The silver star had oak leaves, the bronze star had oak leaves.
Okay.
Both.
But his medals, he was a veteran of World War I and World War II. Mm-hmm. Became a military strategist with the United States government. I mean, this guy's phenomenal. He's heads and shoulders above anything what his father ever thought of being. Mm-hmm. His father was a rectal aperture, but, I'm thinking that this had to have been a generational thing, because his father turned out to be a complete POS. Archie was a true American hero, and yet his son, I believe he had a couple of sons, or a daughter, I think it was his daughter, is a journalist.
His granddaughter is a journalist with Reuters. And is an environmentalist nut job.
Yeah. So she likes to, we won't get into that.
And yet, there was a point in Teddy Roosevelt's life, towards the end of his life, where he actually did feel regret for the type of thing that he created, because he actually wrote Felix Frankfurter, a very revolutionary communist.
Fabian.
Yeah, Fabian.
Yeah.
Here's what Theodore wrote in 1920. You have taken and are taking on behalf of the administration an attitude which seems to me to be fundamentally that of Trotsky and the other Bolsheviki leaders in Russia. an attitude which may be fraught with mischief to this country. Here again, you are engaged in excusing men precisely like the Bolsheviks in Russia, who are murderers and encouragers of murder, who are traitors to their allies, to our republican system of government, and to civilization, as well as to the United States, and whose acts are nevertheless apologized for on the grounds, my dear Mr. Frankfurter, substantially like those which you allege yourself. I am ashamed that I ever thought of progressivism.
You know, it's a shame that Teddy, the Rough Rider, couldn't have maintained that line of thinking and logic throughout
his presidency.
Yeah. But alas, thank God he had offspring like Archibald that, promulgated, true conservatism, true constitutional ideology and adherence to natural law.
Mm-hmm. And, to look at Zygmunt Dobbs, he was one of the great old conservative activists of the 20th century. Yet he was raised in a communist household, was a Trotskyite in his early years, but became a fierce and articulate opponent of communism. He used his research in exposing the great threat of the slow and incremental march of Fabian Socialism. He worked to show the threat of the labor unions and everything. Folks, it shows that when you see the truth, and when you have a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution, you are freed from the chains and shackles that want to tie you to government bondage and serfdom. It's why Alexander de Tocqueville said that socialism really is New Age feudalism. And there can be no denial in that, because when you look at what the socialists want to do, they want to micromanage the facets of our daily lives, and that means monitoring us from cradle until grave. That is the same thing that the serfs did. Sure. And what the feudalist leaders, the lords of the manors, did to their serfs. That is what we are facing with these die-in-the-wool utopian socialists that want to deprive us of our fundamental liberties and unalienable rights.
And getting back to Archibald, again, this guy exuded conservatism out of every pore of his body. He had a long life and career in dealing with finances. He founded the Roosevelt and Cross investment company or investment firm in New York, specialized in municipal bonds. If anybody, and see, this is what I find so cosmic about the connection between Dobbs, Archibald Roosevelt, and Keynes. Keynes declared himself as an economist. Archibald Roosevelt never did, but I'm willing to bet that he understood the economy 10 times over what Keynes ever thought he could have. But again, Keynes wanted to infiltrate things, put up this false dichotomy of, we'll do things economics. We'll take the Communist Manifesto, switch some things around, make it a totally different game based on the economy instead of social status, and we'll implement it in order to implement the Communist Manifesto as a whole.
And isn't that the way it always is with these radical and extremist left-wingers? They always think that what they're doing is creating something new, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. They just redouble down on all of this regurgitated nonsense that has no place in an open, honest, and civilized society like that of the United States. One of the things that Zygmunt Dobbs said about socialism is that and any of this type of totalitarianism, they try try to mask it as new, but it's really a Stone Age mentality. That it is this idea of putting us back into the primordial ooze of stupidity and to have basically a gangster-type mentality. He literally calls socialism an underworld, because they are gangsters. He said that they act like gangsters. They may fight with one another like cats and dogs, but whenever they sense an attack coming from the outside, they close ranks and stand up for one another. That is truly something to be said for the collectivist mentality. Folks, that's why Democrats, who loathe and despise each other, will still close ranks when they feel they're being attacked. Look at the way that Boyne Me Sanders, who does not really like Hillary Clinton, but closes ranks because of the email scandal and the investigation into it. He's going to protect her because these attacks are from the outsiders, and they hate the outsiders more than they hate each other.
Yeah. And Archibald Roosevelt actually was a prestigious member of the John Birch Society, which, folks, the John Birch Society has been getting, over the years, has gotten a lot of negativity thrown their way, mostly because they go against the grain of what it should be perceived as what our economic system and our Republican form of government should be, as touted by these Fabians, and even the ones that are of the Republican Party, that, oh, well, I'm against socialism, but yet they exhibit actions and espouse various different ideologies that are directly in line with Fabianism. I'm not all that up on the John Birch Society. I've researched them a little bit. Randy is more up on them, but from what I've read, I don't have an issue with the John Birch Society at all. In fact, I align with a lot of the things that they say.
Right. In fact, the John Birch Society started in 1958, December 9th. It was led by Robert W. Welch Jr., who died in 1985. And what it was done is it was looking at John Birch, who is named after, who was an American Baptist missionary and military intelligence officer who was shot and killed by communist forces in China in August 1945. The entire purpose of the John Birch Society was to try to prevent the communist manipulation and takeover of the United States. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the John Birch Society is still active today. However, as Jeremy had mentioned, there have been a lot of unfair characterizations, and basically you have these devious left-wingers engaging in a full campaign of character assassination. So they've been labeled as ultra-conservative, right-wing extremist, far-right, and these are put out by groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, and that lists the society as a patriot hate group. Now, how can you be a patriot hate group? You see, once again, folks, this comes down to all of that semantics. It's why Jeremy and I have been focusing on this since our first episode aired on September 11th of 2015. It shows that they use these labels as a political weapon to foster this idea of the cancerous doctrine of political correctness to divide and conquer. Folks, they want to pit us against each other. They want to destroy the unified national identity of the American people. And that is why they are pushing for this type of balkanization. And it goes back to that college that was in Arkansas. That was designed. Arkansas was seen as a central hub to basically radicalize these students and to create the narrative that the South was always just this racist, bigoted, homophobic, sexist place, and by using Arkansas they could spread out and then head to the top of the country. Now, folks, remember Bill Clinton? Where was he a governor of? Arkansas. He was a left-winger. He was the most left-winger Southerner to have attained the office of president since Jimmy Carter.
Now, with the John Birch Society, again, this all the character assassinations going against it. Well, you can look at any organization or outfit that speaks on constitutionalism, conservatism, natural law, our national identity under national or natural law, so on and so forth. Another organization like the Oath Keepers. See, and what's happened with the Oath Keepers, there's an infiltration happening. Okay? Just as these communists and these Keynesians and Fabians infiltrated the United States, they're infiltrating every single outfit or entity that rises up against them. When you have people like Ron Paul have all of his, Cooterfarians, as we call them, and if you know the history behind Ron Paul, you'll see the connection there to that name. They've actually, adopted themselves or adapted into these organizations, and then they start to destroy them from within. They start to dwindle them. They'll latch on and say, oh, well, we're all for this too, but, we need to have this as well. They want to incrementalize things. They want to bring more to the organization than what the organization is actually about.
Right.
People like Ron Paul, their supporters, they infiltrated the Oath Keepers. Right. They've infiltrated the John Birch Society. You have all these people that say, well, we just need to legalize all the drugs. Gary Johnson. Let's just legalize all the drugs. Well, you know what? Keynes was all about legalizing drugs.
Keynes was he was all about these weird things. And Jeremy, one of the things that really did hurt the John Birch Society, and this is one of the areas where I found William F. Buckley Jr. to be just out of line, totally out of line. In 1962, William F. Buckley Jr., writing for National Review, the same one that has Fred Barnes, those people, National Review and Weekly Standard, those two. Well, he wrote in 1962 that Welch and the John Birch Society were far removed from common sense and urged the GOP to purge itself of Welch's influence. What was this in response to? It was in response to Welch trying to protest America's increased involvement with the United Nations, which, as Jeremy's already pointed out, had very much so been infiltrated and focused around and even designed by Fabianism.
Leonard Woolf was the architect of the League of Nations.
So why was William F. Buckley Jr. attacking an organization that was actually taking a stand for American values and virtues?
There are many wolves amongst us in sheep's clothing.
Yes.
But I have to also say that there are many sheep in wolf's clothing as well, because it is those individuals, like our listeners, that understand, the fundamental tenets of natural law and the Constitution and our supreme duty and obligation to maintain and protect our unalienable rights. Mm-hmm. It is those of us that are sheep in wolf's clothing that are going to be the ones that restore our republic to which our founders intended it to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so you see, folks, the dangers that have been facing our country have been with us for a very long time now. And that is why we say it is so important for you to have a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent As always, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. And as always, I'm joined by my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton. We want to thank you for flying the Wright Flyer. We hope to see you the next time that we take to the friendly airwaves, leaving you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment, as we always do. Take care, folks. We also invite you to leave comments either here on our YouTube page or on our Facebook page or our Google Plus page. We will see you next time. Do take care, folks. Thank you for flying the Wright Flyer.